Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I am Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. Foreign ministers of Australia, India and Japan and the Secretary of State of the United States of America met this week in Tokyo for the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting. They reaffirmed their commitment, common principles and capacities to preserve and strengthen the international order for the global good. The ministers of the four member countries discussed and deliberated on shared challenges and presented their respective visions for stability and prosperity together with other countries in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond, and also their plans for the Quad to provide tangible benefits for the region. The joint statement released after the meeting stated Quad's steadfast commitment to a free and open Indo-Pacific, which is both inclusive and resilient. It mentioned the Quad's advancement of a positive and practical agenda to support the Indo-Pacific region's sustainable development, stability and prosperity, responding to the region's needs. At the same time, the statement reiterated the member countries' support to the region through practical cooperation on challenges such as maritime security, critical and emerging technologies, cyber security, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief and so on. They pledged adherence to international law, particularly as reflected in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, to address challenges to the global maritime rules-based order. Satisfied with how deeply and systematically Quad has got embedded in our foreign policies, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar asserted that it's not a talk shop anymore, but a platform that generates practical outcomes. On the show today, we'll talk about some of these outcomes that have enhanced the value of Quad with two eminent guests. So let me begin the program by introducing them to you. I'm pleased to welcome former Ambassador Arun Kumar Singh. Thank you, sir, for your time. Welcome to Sansad TV. And we also have with us Professor Swaran Singh, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor, glad to have you with us on this edition of Perspective. Let me in fact pose the first question to you, Professor. What we are seeing today is Quad having an expansive agenda, including connectivity, energy security, maritime security, also shared technology with countries in the global south. What's interesting is that a group that began as a coordination mechanism back in 2004 to respond to the humanitarian crisis in the aftermath of the tsunami, 20 years later, when we talk about it, it reflects its agenda having grown manyfold. How do you trace back this journey of the Quad from being just a coordination mechanism to today being one of the most significant global forums?
Thank you, Tina, for having me on your program. I think if you look at the 24-paragraph joint statement issued yesterday in Tokyo, it shows how deeply engaged all these four countries have come to be. Almost any issue that one can think of is today on their agenda. They have by now about 16 working groups. And as you mentioned, the Quad has become a very integral part of foreign policies of all these four countries. Now, obviously, how has this come about? You mentioned about their response to the tsunami of 2004. When they first came together. Okay. Then, of course, it appeared that Beijing was not happy with this kind of formation happening. And of course, at that time, these nations had slightly different leaders at home. And finally, in 2017, it was revived, and it has since then gone really full speed ahead, starting annual summit meetings, which even happened online when pandemic did not allow them to meet face to face. So in that sense, today, there are even concerns that Quad perhaps should focus much more on consolidation rather than constant expansion of all possible areas that they can come about. What keeps them together are two things very quickly. One, all of them share China challenge, which is not often articulated as the reason of their coming together. But China's unprecedented rise and the way China has behaved, particularly South China Sea, which was mentioned not directly by naming China in the joint statement, was mentioned in terms of all countries have to ensure respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, follow rule of law, and so on. Second was the whole creation of ASEAN at the center stage of this entire big region. And since late 1990s, ASEAN came to be very friendly to China. In fact, despite all the problems in South China Sea, ASEAN has not stood up together collectively in standing against China in terms of their claims in South China Sea. So since ASEAN was perhaps found no longer very potent instrument of dealing with this China challenge, all the major stakeholders, Australia, Japan, United States, and of course India was invited to come into it, have come together to really ensure, as was being repeatedly mentioned in Tokyo, as they being the only grouping that can ensure free and open Indo-Pacific.
Right.
But at the same time, they all continuously keep saying that ASEAN must be the center stage platform. But we clearly understand that now the onus and the focus and gravitas of maintaining regional stability has moved to Quad. And because Quad is so strongly embedded in these four countries' foreign policy, it ensures that it will be a potent instrument, which is partly also visible by the interest that several other nations have shown to join. And therefore, the conversations about Quad Plus, Quad Plus Plus have also been there. So fundamentally, I think you're right in saying that this is one platform which has shown enormous bonhomie and potency, and I think will play a major role in defining the regional geopolitics.
Okay. Ambassador, your views on the rise of Quad from 2007 when it was formalized by the late Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. Then it sort of became dormant and we saw a revival again in 2017. 2024, the foreign ministers meeting and the joint statement reads out and it lists the elaborate agenda items. The fact is that, in this challenging, uncertain, volatile world, how significant, how relevant is Quad? Because it talks about global good and we talk about inclusive, free and open Indo-Pacific.
I think there are lessons in how the Quad came about initially in 2004, 2005, why it became dormant and why was it revived. Now, of course, as you mentioned, it came about as a way of coordinating response to a humanitarian disaster. And it was found that these were the four navies, US, Australia, Japan, and India, that were in a position to mount a major operation that was required at that time. And therefore, it was better for them to coordinate to make the operation more effective. And that gave the idea of doing more things together. Now, China reacted very negatively to that. They thought that it had the potential of becoming something which could be a challenge for China. Now, Australia in particular, because they had a very deep economic linkage with China, then backed off from Quad-related arrangements. And that's how, after that, for some time, it became dormant. Even the US, if you look at the period 2004-2005, was focused on its efforts in Afghanistan. It was not paying the same level of attention to the Pacific or the Indo-Pacific. And the Obama administration that came in after the Bush administration was initially a little, they were trying to sort out how do they want to define their strategy to China. In the first couple of years, they spoke about strategic reassurance to China, that its legitimate concerns and demands would be accommodated in the international system. And then they found that was not working because China was becoming very unilateral and assertive in its positions. So they started talking of a pivot to Asia. Then they felt that this was too strong a word. Then they started talking of a rebalance to Asia. Even that they could not carry out because they continued to be preoccupied with the developments in West Asia, developments in Europe. There was Russia's action in Ukraine in 2014 at that time. So it was only when President Trump came in and part of the votes he got was by the US middle class, which felt itself disempowered by manufacturing moving on to China. And the income level stagnated, death rates went up, drug addiction went up. So Trump felt that he wanted to project a very strong posture related to China. And it was that framework that he revived the Quad. Now, each of the players, although they had very strong bilateral relationship with each other, initially moved very tentatively because of the past history. So initially, the meetings were at mid-official level. And after the meeting, no joint statements were issued. Every delegation issued its own statement with some harmonization, but they were different. But eventually, towards the end of the Trump administration, there was a foreign minister level meeting of the Quad, signaling that they want to now make it more regular and take it to a higher level. It was the Biden administration, when they came in, that raised the Quad to the summit level meetings. And they've had one virtual summit level meeting in September 2021. And after that, 3 in-person meetings. And so now it is the turn of India to host an in-person meeting, which should be held sometime this year. And they've come out regularly with joint statements. So that's the context in which Quad is evolving. So as you mentioned, what the Quad are trying to signal is that they're not necessarily anti-China in their orientation. They want a rules-based order in the region so that the unilateral and assertive position China is taking in South China Sea, East China Sea, which are in violation of international law, are not accepted. And beyond that, they also want to show that they bring a positive agenda to the table, not just a negative in terms of negating whatever China is trying to do. So in terms of positive agenda, they are signaling to the countries in the region that through their cooperation, they are bringing benefit to the countries in the region, and the countries in the region should also look at the Quad more positively. So that they've done things like the vaccine initiative, and they provided almost 400 million vaccines to the countries in the region during the COVID. Now they are sharing maritime awareness data with the countries in the Pacific so that illegal fishing can be challenged. They are doing work related to critical and emerging technology, infrastructure, digital connectivity. So the whole idea is that countries in the region see that they have options other than China for positive economic and technology partnerships. And that's something that they would welcome. So that's the approach. But again, you must note that Quad is not the only active organization in this region. You also have something called the Squad, which is the US, Australia, Japan, and Philippines. There is also the AUKUS, right. US, Australia, and the UK arrangement for nuclear propulsion submarines. So there's a whole new architecture of international security that is being worked upon to deal with the challenge of a rise in China or a rise in China. And Quad certainly is a very important part of this architecture that is building up.
Sure. We'll also talk about AUKUS and whether there's overlapping of shared interests as far as these groupings are concerned in the Indo-Pacific region. But before that, Professor, one thing that we would like to understand from you, we've been talking about the growth of Quad and the expansive agenda over the years. Ambassador mentioned that how the rise has been far from smooth. There have been several factors that he spoke about, and each of the countries to begin with worked or had different approaches, even though they were part of the same group. Can we now say that a lot of factors have contributed towards convergence on all of these issues, and that the keen interest at the top leadership level has also led to the enhancement of Quad's growth?
I think over the years, one can notice increased cohesion and better understanding of all four countries and their leaders at different levels. And there are reasons for it. Obviously, President Trump's period, and especially Mike Pompeo's speeches, were far more sort of strong and I dare say even anti-Chinese. And the other three, particularly India, was not very comfortable in towing that line. Mm-hmm. And that is how sometimes we had a situation of course, lately, President Biden's fundamental approach to China has remained the same, but the way it is operationalized, the way it is communicated has slightly become nuanced and soft. So that is something which has made Quad far more cohesive. I remember Mike Pompeo invariably used to say we need to distinguish between the party which is ruling China and the Chinese people. That language is no longer there from any of the Quad partners anymore. India, on the other hand, which is the only Quad member which is not an alliance partner, otherwise Australia and Japan are alliance partners of the United States, was understood to be most reluctant, and the Prime Minister had openly said in Shangri-La Dialogue speech of 2018 that India would not like to see this region militarized, that we would like to see region continuing to be inclusive. And at that stage, initially, India had in fact opened this issue of debating Indo-Pacific geopolitics with China in our annual maritime dialogue. And India believed that both China and Russia should be equally as much stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific region, and it should not just be restricted to Quad. That also has changed because of the border tension since 2020 in that sense. So India has also moved slightly more closer to the central gravitation point of the Quad, which is fundamentally trying to ensure that China is not able to push through its way, undermining the norms, the rule of law, etc., which ASEAN has not been able to stand up to, and therefore Quad needs to stand up and deal with that. And as far as AUKUS is concerned, I think that is a very clear signal that when India was determined in not letting Quad become an Asian NATO. United States had to think of an alternative platform, which is where AUKUS was created. And now, obviously, there is no conversation about Quad becoming an Asian NATO anymore. So I think there are various reasons. And of course, leadership in Australia, experience of Australia with Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy. There are various reasons why these four nations over years have become a little more cohesive. And I think that explains their confidence in expanding their agenda to almost any item that one can imagine is now today on their agenda in that sense. That's why the Foreign Minister of India in Tokyo said we have 16 working groups and more maybe on the way to come. So I think it's a very sign of success of any platform to be able to grow as fast as that. And it's not only simple expression of intent. One can list out a whole lot of things that have actually happened on the ground.
You're right, and in that context, the External Affairs Minister also said that it's not a talk shop anymore, it's generating positive outcomes. I'll take that to the Ambassador and try and understand from him. Ambassador, 16 working groups, more on the way, because we're discussing a lot of other issues on which there can be more and more convergence. If you could tell us about some of the key areas in which we've been coordinating closely and which are yielding positive results for the region.
So one of the things that's happening is that each of the countries, the four countries, has a very strong bilateral relationship with each other. So India has a very strong bilateral relationship with Australia, with Japan, with the United States.
Right.
But the Quad framework is enabling us and creating a positive momentum for doing even more bilateral. So it works both ways. Because you have a strong bilateral relationship, you do more in the framework of Quad. Because you have a strong partnership, you're willing to do more with each other bilaterally. So I think with that coordination, what we are seeing is that in a whole range of areas, maritime security, critical and emerging technologies, cyber security, of course, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, health security. We spoke about the vaccine initiative. They're also working on what can be done to prevent or deal, response to a future pandemic. How should countries in the region deal with that? Dealing with climate change, counterterrorism issues, infrastructure and connectivity, and dealing with the debt crisis. So there are many areas where through their discussion, through their cooperation, they are bringing positive options for the countries in the region to look at. Now, if you look at, for example, in the case of Palau, they have actually worked to set up open radio access network as part of a future telecom rollout. So there are areas where they're coming forward with very, very concrete programs of cooperation. We've also had the STEM fellowship, under which initially 100 students from the Quad member countries went to the U.S. For a fellowship, and they were funded by the Quad countries. And now that has been expanded also to countries in the region, including the ASEAN countries. So that's the effort, basically to signal that China's predatory economic and technology policies are not the only option that the countries in the region see. Because, after all, China has tremendous economic strength. China's GDP is 5 times India's GDP. US GDP is 28 trillion, China's GDP is 18 trillion. And China is the largest trading partner of more than 100 countries in the world. Okay. So that is what has come about due to industry being sucked into China, overcapacity being developed in China, and which is creating difficulty for a large number of countries, including US and Europe. So now there's a response to that.
Okay, Professor, so, while the Ambassador spoke about this strong interactive dynamic between the Quad and our respective bilateral and trilateral relationship with the member countries, what have been some of the important ramifications of the rise and emergence of the emergence and rise of Quad on global geopolitics? Also, our bilateral relationship with countries like Russia, which also is a time-tested partner.
I think our relationship with Russia was initially a matter of concern, particularly at the beginning of Ukraine war. But India has withstood, and I think by now Western nations have kind of reconciled to the fact that India will continue to engage Russia the way India has. But it is also important to underline how India's language vis-a-vis Russia, as far as Ukraine crisis is concerned, has enormously changed. We, if you remember, began in February 2 years ago by saying we are concerned or we regret. Of course, when Boka massacre happened, India strongly said in August of that year that India wants to have an international investigation done as to what happened there. Then in September of 2021, Indian Prime Minister said this era is not era of war. May last year, in Hiroshima summit, Indian Prime Minister said all nations must not voluntarily change any national boundaries. And now in his Moscow visit, again he said that no peace talks can be either conceived of or fruitful during bombing happening around. And bombing was happening near Kiev at that time. So India's language has formed up very clearly. And the way the paragraph on Ukraine is designed in this joint statement yesterday in Tokyo, again is a reflection of India's approach to Ukraine issue being very, very firm and dynamic. So it's not a static neutrality of India. It's been very dynamic, growing and changing. And I think West also appreciates over a period of time. But what is interesting to see how these four have also begun to come together and work together. Most recent example is Papua New Guinea in May this year. Just 2 months back, when there was a huge tragic landslide there, these nations immediately stood up and I think have already sanctioned more than $5 million together for the relief there. But most important example, of course, is there what is today called Quad naval exercises. India has been doing naval exercises in the United States from 92 onwards, Malabar exercises. Over a period of time in 2007, Japan had joined it. For a few years, it missed it, then again joined it. India, for some reason, had been very reluctant to allow Australia to join it, but now Australia also is part of what is now called the Quad naval exercises. That leaves, I think, an enormous impression on countries in the region, including China, as to how strong the mutual trust and understanding. We usually say if armed forces of countries begin to work together, that is a reflection of very strong trust between them. Otherwise, you usually begin with academics, journalists, or other people meeting each other in, track 2, track 3, track 1.5. But when militaries begin to work together, and the focus very clearly is on HADR operations, and of course, particularly on domain awareness, right, which again is part of the whole paragraph is mentioned here. So I think there are a series of lists of activities that are showcasing that the agenda has not just expanded, but also delivered on the ground, one after another examples of that.
Okay, Ambassador, so while there has been an exponential rise, the overall messaging, and as the External Affairs Minister puts it, is that all democratic polities, pluralistic societies, market economies are working together for a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based order and for global good. Are there also challenges and limitations that the Quad faces towards its future growth?
No, I think it's important that they consolidate step by step to strengthen cooperation among themselves and then bring positive agenda to countries in the region. And so as long as they're able to do that, I think they can expand. For example, if you look at some of the newer areas, they have spoken now about exploring opportunities for cooperation in synthetic biology. So that's a new area. Or enhancing the resilience of semiconductor supply chain among Quad members. So in this manner, they can bring newer elements to the table to deepen their bilateral, quadrilateral partnership and for benefit in the region. Now, of course, some countries will react negatively. ASEAN will be positive so long as ASEAN centrality for the region's security is recognized. And that's why Quad has said repeatedly that they support ASEAN centrality. China will react negatively. Russia, from what we see from the comments of some of their leaders, including the foreign minister, has been negative about the Quad, partly because of their relationship with China, partly they watch closely how India's relationship with U.S., Japan, and others are developing. And therefore, India has signaled that, we very much see Russia also as part of the Indo-Pacific. And when Prime Minister a couple of years visited Vladivostok, we spoke of starting, building a maritime corridor between Chennai and Vladivostok, right, and India investing in the Russian Far East. So it will have to be handled in a way that enhance cooperation bilaterally, quadrilaterally with the countries in the region and try and allay the concerns that any of your other partners may have.
Certainly. So that having been said, we'll have to wind up the program. Time allows me to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the program today, sharing your thoughts with us and our viewers. And to you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well. I'll see you next time. Take good care of yourselves. Keep watching Sansad TV.
watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.